In this special Parsha podcast, there's only going to be one segment. I actually had 2 more segments. We were going to do 3, but the more I thought about it, this one is so important. It's so critical for us in our lives. It's going to be such an instructive and topical subject. I decided to focus just on this. Now, it's a subject which is easy to talk about, but it's much harder to implement. And hopefully when we talk about it, we'll also take a step to try to figure out how we can get a bit more of this in our lives. So Parshas Vaeira picks up right where Parshas Shemos ended off, and we're in middle of a conversation between Moshe and the Almighty. At the end of last week's Parsha, Moshe was levying a complaint against God. God had instructed Moshe, commissioned Moshe to go save the Jewish people. And Moshe objected, one objection after another. And finally he consented, he agreed, he acceded to go. He gets permission from Jethro, he rendezvous with Aaron, he convinces the elders, he goes to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh does not cave to his demand, and instead of releasing the Jewish people from their bondage, instead of attenuating, mitigating, reducing their burden and enslavement, he exacerbates it. He makes it worse. Previously, he had been providing them with the ingredients for bricks. And now he instructs his taskmasters to withhold those ingredients and to demand that the daily quota of bricks be maintained. And the nation is foraging everywhere to find the required ingredients. And all this could be blamed on Moshe and Aaron. And the people complained to Moshe and Aaron, what did you do? You should have kept your mouth silent. And Moshe goes to God. He says, why did you send me? I wanted to improve the state of the nation, and instead things got worse. And the end of last week's Parsha, God responded. God began to respond by saying, not to worry. You'll still see that I will do to Pharaoh, for he will release the nation with a strong hand, and he will in fact evict them from the land. And our Parsha begins with God continuing his message. I prayed to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob with this mode of divine relationship, but not in that mode, in a different mode. I promised, but I didn't deliver. And now I'm going to deliver. I'm going to extract the nation from Egypt. I'm going to bring them to the land of Canaan. I heard the cries of the Jewish people. I remembered my covenant. And now I once again instruct you to go speak to the nation and tell them that I will take you out of the servitude and suffering and torment of Egypt. I'm going to save you from the labor. I'm going to redeem you with a strong arm, with great wonders. I'm going to take you to me to be my nation, and I will be your God, and I will bring you to the land. This is a very hopeful and encouraging message that God is instructing Moshe to convey to the Jewish people. Those are the first 7 verses of our Parsha. And Moshe does as instructed. Verse 8. So this is chapter 6, verse 9 of chapter 6. Vaydaber Moshe, and Moshe spoke. He told these words to Bnei Israel, to the Israelites. So Moshe has the initial efforts. They flop. Pharaoh makes it worse. The people complain to Moshe. Moshe complains to God. God responds. God encourages Moshe to go again. He does with a very hopeful message. And it falls flat. V'lo shamu Moshe. They did not hear. They did not hearken, did not heed. They did not listen to Moshe. Mikotzer ruach ume'avodah kasha. Because of shortness of breath and harsh labor. This is where, if you think about it, if you map out the story, this is not the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning of one stage of exile. Everything that happens henceforth is going to be positive. It's going to be accretive to the nation. They're going to leave. This is the low point. This is the nadir. This is the darkest before dawn. Moshe has an encouraging message to share to the Jewish people. And he shares the message and they don't hear him. Mikotze ruach, they have shortness of breath, and they are being subjected to harsh labor. Now, the Ramban, he differentiates what is shortness of breath and what is harsh labor. Shortness of breath, he explains, that is their fear that they will be killed if they listen to Moshe. What is the harsh labor? Why did that prevent them from hearing what Moshe had to say? That refers to the fact that the nation was so inundated with work that they were not capable of hearing and thinking about what Moshe had to say. There's two reasons, says the way the Ramban explains the verse. There's two reasons why the nation did not hear what Moshe had to say. Number one, shortness of breath, which he explains is that they understood that this would be a capital offense, and therefore we don't want to listen to Moshe. And harsh labor, that refers to a different reason why the nation was incapable of hearing what Moshe had to say. The labor was so intense. The enslavement was so unrelenting that they did not have a moment of peace, of quiet, of serenity, to be able to listen and to consider and to evaluate with what Moshe had to say. They didn't have a second to think, to listen properly, or to contemplate. And this is what I want to focus on in this week's Parsha podcast. The nation was so consumed with labor that they could not even hear what Moshe had to say. They were drowning in work, in labor, in servitude, that disabled their ability, that precluded them from being able to even hear what Moshe had to say. They were in their own world, immersed in their work, compelled, of course, to do this work, forced and enslaved against their will to do this work. And the work was so all-encompassing that they got into their own little world. And Moshe, he's saying things, and he's trying to convey a message, and it's a nuanced message. And it comes from God. I'll take you, and I'll bring you, and I'll extract you, and miracles, all these nice things. And it doesn't penetrate. It cannot enter their universes. They're sealed off from the world. Moshe is unable to make an impact. His words make no impression. And this is a part of what the state of the nation at this time. And of course, it's by design. I want to argue that this is the essence of the enslavement. What Pharaoh was doing to the nation was primarily about thwarting their ability to have the time, the capacity, the space to think, to plan, to scheme, to consider, to evaluate, to contemplate. And they reach the point over here in this verse of peak enslavement, peak labor that's so suffocating that there's no window out of it. There's nothing that can be conveyed to them. There's no message, there's no sentiment that can be told to them that would even be considered. And once that happened, they've fulfilled the prophecy that they will be enslaved. Now they're ready for redemption. They're ripe for salvation, for deliverance. Now this idea is already hinted to in last week's Parsha. So Moshe goes, chapter 5, goes to Pharaoh and demands the nation be released. And Pharaoh is quite incredulous at Moshe's request. Who is this God? I don't know anything about this God. Why are you doing this, Moshe and Aaron? Why are you disturbing the people from their work? The people are supposed to work. Why are you disturbing them? And again, Pharaoh is emphasizing, and it's important to read this really, chapter 5, all of chapter 5. Pharaoh is emphasizing the point that you're trying to get them to stop working. And that's intolerable. And Pharaoh increases the work. And he tells the taskmen and the foremen, don't give straw to the people and maintain the quota. Because they're lazy. They don't want to work. Let the work be heavier upon the men. Let them engage in it, and let them not pay attention to false words. This idea that Pharaoh doesn't want them to have the space, the time, the focus, the capacity to pay attention to anything else. Now, I'm going to suggest as we shall proceed that this is really the essence of the experience in Egypt. Of course, the Jewish people's experience in Egypt is really the founding experience of our people. This is when a family, the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, of course, and the 70 souls, but the family is transformed into a nation. And it's kind of amazing that our nation was founded in exile, in a foreign land, which is kind of very unique. I think it's the only example of that. Our nation's been founded in Egypt. And the essence, I will suggest, is all about this idea that Pharaoh wants to constrict their worldview, to disable any competing thoughts of consideration of other alternative ways of life, to banish all of that from their purview. Now, our sages tell us that Pharaoh, on an allegorical level, he represents the Yetzer Hara. Of course, we know that the Torah is multidimensional. That's the theme of year 8 of the Parsha podcast. It's deep and deeper to try to see a bit deeper into the substrata of the Parsha. And our sages tell us that on an allegorical level, Pharaoh is the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. And whatever Pharaoh did to the Israelites, that is precisely what the Yetzer Hara does to us. So the whole story of the nation going down to Egypt and being subjugated to Pharaoh and being swallowed up and engulfed by Pharaoh, and does it need to be extricated from there? And it's not simple at all. That's not just an ancient historical tale, the founding event of our people. This is also the story of our lives. Each one of us is sent down to Egypt. Each one of us is subjected to a fierce and conniving Pharaoh. And each one of us has to find a path out of Egypt and towards Sinai, towards God, towards Torah. There's a midrash that I dedicated a chapter in my book on that talks about, or gives an analogy, a parable of a man, a sailor, who was on a ship. And the captain of the ship tossed him overboard. He was thrown to the ferocious waters below. And he's going to drown. And the ship captain takes a lifeline and throws it, casts it into the water, and tells the flailing sailor, grab onto this lifeline, hold on really tight, and I'll pull you up. I'll bring you back on board the ship deck. And the Midrash explains this is the model. God, so to speak, the captain, he has our soul in close proximity to him. But he takes the soul and throws it into this world. And the soul is going to drown. It's going to be swallowed up by these raging waters, the Yetzer Hara, the physicality, all the forces that are designed to inflict tremendous damage to the soul. But the Almighty also throws us a lifeline, and that's the Torah. And that's symbolized by the mitzvah that incorporates all of Torah, namely that of the tzitzis, which is the ropes, the strings, the fringes. You see the tzitzis, you remember all the mitzvos of Hashem because you remember what the mitzvahs are all about. They're about pulling you out of that sea and bringing you to close proximity to God the way you were prior. V'hisem k'doshim, you should be holy to your God. We say in chapter 15 of Numbers regarding tzitzis. The objective of mitzvos is to pull us back to proximity to the Almighty. But God throws us into the water. God throws us into Egypt. God throws us into the clutches of Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, the force that's designed and engineered to really threaten, to really imperil the well-being of our soul. And whatever Pharaoh is doing to the Israelites is instructive for us, because that's precisely the nature of our struggle against the Yetzer Hara. And therefore, it's critical to understand what's happening here. What does Pharaoh want? What's he doing to the nation? What exactly is this enslavement all about? And here's where the tide turns. This is when the intensification of the enslavement becomes the strongest. They're not given straw. They're not given the ingredients of the bricks, and they still need to maintain the quota. And why? Pharaoh says himself, to be so consumed with work that this whole idea that, you have a higher version of yourself and you have the capacity of self-determination and you may have lofty ambitions and you may remember that you're the Israelites, you're the scions of titans, of the greatest of men, and that you have a destiny to continue and expand upon the work of your illustrious antecedents. All these elevated ideals, Pharaoh wanted them silenced. Pharaoh wanted them suppressed. Pharaoh wanted there will not be the capacity to have these sentiments expressed. That's what Pharaoh wanted. That was his aim, and that is precisely what the Yetzer Hara does to us. The most effective tool that our arch villains, so both Pharaoh and the Yetzer Hara, that they have in their arsenal, in their repertoire, in their quiver, in their toolkit, is to encumber us with so much that we don't have the ability to ever hear Moshe, to ever hear what he has to say. And the most encouraging and inspiring messages, we don't even hear him. And the idea that God wants a relationship with us, and he wants to take us to him, and he wants that we should be his people, and he wants to remove all the difficulties in our lives, we don't hear it. It doesn't penetrate. We're in our own world, hermetically sealed, and fending off all the messages that Moshe may be delivering to us. And if this is one of the major problems that we face, we also know what the solution to this problem is. How do we respond? What is the way to counter this force? There's an incredible piece in Mesilas Yesharim, that's the way of the upright, from Ramchal, where he talks about the importance of contemplation, of consideration, of finding the time and the space to consider, to open up your mind to what you're doing, to what you're living for, to what agendas really should dominate your life, what you should invest your time in. So I want to read some citations from chapter 2 and chapter 3 about this. He says like this. He's talking about the importance to be fastidious in your life, to make sure you're making the right decisions, to be meticulous, to be vigilant in your behavior. And he says the way to do that is to have contemplation and to oversee and to consider your actions and your deeds. What's the most powerful way to live an elevated and perfected life? To have time where you consider what you're doing, and you evaluate what you're doing, and you assess what you're doing, and you oversee your life. You don't just live being led like a puppet by other forces. You become the master. You're in charge. You're at the wheel. You're at the helm. You made a decision of what you want to do in your life. And then he says, if you don't do this, you're going to allow your soul, this is his words, scary stuff, you're going to endanger it with potentially destruction. You should not be like a blind man fumbling about in the dark. That's the state of someone who just lives life without consideration, without contemplation, without ever assessing what they're doing with their lives. And then he says that this is the most logical thing that a person should do. If the Almighty gives you a brain and intellect to save yourself from devastation, why should you ignore it? There is no lunacy as terrible as that. And then he says that someone who lives a life that he never contemplates, he never considers, he never evaluates, he never assesses, he never tries to get outside of himself to look at themselves. He says such a person is worse than an animal. Animals are scared of danger. Animals never willfully embrace something which could be harmful to them. If a person is never considering, well, maybe I'm doing something which is harmful, which is deleterious, a favorite word here on the Parsha podcast, well, in a certain dimension, they're worse than animals, says Ramchal. And he, again, uses very, very strong words, and he gives an analogy. If someone walks in their world, you have a life, right? It's your world. And if you're walking in your world, and you're not ever considering, contemplating whether or not your decisions and your choices are good or bad, behold, such a person, says Ramchal, is like a blind person who's walking at the edge of the river. Such a person, their danger is ever present, and they are on the brink of disaster. And then he compares, he says, when someone lives a life of lack of contemplation, it's willful blindness. If they don't consider what's the right thing to do, what should I choose, what's a good thing that I should embrace, and what's a bad thing that I should avoid, that I should eschew. Here's the critical line. Behold, this is a quote. This is, truthfully, one of the schemes of the Yetzer Hara. One of the cunning schemes of the Yetzer Hara is to encumber a person with work, with non-stop, incessant work. So that way the person's heart is always occupied. And they don't have the space to contemplate and to do some introspection and to examine and to look on the path that they're living. That's what the Yetzer Hara does. Because the Yetzer Hara knows that if a person would only just a little bit, for a small amount of time, consider just a little bit a person's path, right away, they'd improve their ways. And they would regret any bad decisions that they made. And all the sins and all the mistakes that they are prone to do, they'll now avoid it. And then he tells us, this is what Pharaoh did. This was the plan of Pharaoh. Encumber them with work. What was Pharaoh's intention? His intention was that they would not have any space to consider, to pay attention, to examine, to plot. He wanted to fill their hearts, fill their times, fill their lives. There's no room for anything else to creep in. Any thought of introspection and contemplation, because they're working nonstop and there's not even a time to catch their breath, they'll never consider anything. So too, this is what the Yetzer Hara does. The Yetzer Hara, he tells us that this is a man of war. and is well trained in deception. And there's no way to fight back unless you too use deception. He quotes the verse as he does. Every point that he makes, he supports it with a verse in Scripture. Now I noticed that the very first mention of the Egyptian exile, of the state of the Jewish people inside Egypt, it's found in the first verse of Parsha's Vaeira. So this is still chapter 47 of Genesis. This is the final Parsha installment of the book of Genesis, 12 of 12. And the verse talking about how Jacob lived in Egypt. And Rashi observes that there's something found in the beginning of that Parsha, so Parsha's Vaeira, that's not found in any other Parsha. So you have 54 Parshas in the Torah. One of them has this feature that no one else has. And that is that in a Torah scroll, typically there's a paragraph break separating one Parsha from another. Just like if you have a different book, between the books of Genesis and Exodus, you have 4 empty lines. So it's very easy to spot it. If you're scrolling through a Torah scroll, you'll see when there's just big blank 4 empty lines, you know that you've reached a point between 2 books. But similarly, between 2 parshas, there's almost always, there is a paragraph break. But between Parshas Vayigash, the 11th installment in Genesis, and Parshas Vayechi, the final one, there's no break. And if you're reading from the Torah, it's hard to find it because it's right in the middle of a whole sea of words. And the first comment that Rashi offers on the Parsha, Parshas Vayechi, why is this Parsha all closed up? Why is there no white space? Why is there, you don't have the typical paragraph break that you have in every other Parsha? Because this is talking about the death of Jacob. And once Jacob died, the hearts and the eyes of the nation were closed up because of the suffering of enslavement. Once Jacob died, the nation was enslaved. And the way that the Torah finds it fitting to represent their enslavement is to remove the white space, is to remove the paragraph break. That's the essence of exile. The first indication of the subjugation of our nation, that all rhymed, the first indication of subjugation of our nation, is a lack of white space. There's no time to contemplate, to consider. By the way, the purpose of paragraph breaks, we find out in Rashi, in Parshas Vayikra. So this is the beginning of Leviticus. It's easy to find it. Chapter 1, verse 1. Rashi talks about why there are paragraph breaks in the Torah. And he says, it's to give you time, and even to give Moshe time, to stop and think and contemplate and have some introspection. The reason why there are paragraph breaks in the Torah, it's not so we should skip the breaks. There's a way to read the breaks. You don't jump to the next line. You spend the time that it would take to read it by not reading, by stopping, by considering, by contemplating. And there's different types of breaks. There's ones where it's just, a few spaces within one line. And then sometimes the break goes all the way to the end of the line. And like we said, there are some times that you have 4 empty lines. You're supposed to have a lot of contemplation. The Almighty did not pepper Moshe with an uninterrupted salvo of teachings. No, he taught something and then he stopped. That doesn't mean that Moshe is supposed to space out. He's supposed to consider, to pause and consider and try to absorb the message, try to digest it, to reflect upon it. And says Rashi, again, this is in Vayikra 1:1. If God teaching Moshe, it requires pauses and breaks for reflection. Certainly, when we learn, it requires breaks and reflection. The white space in the Torah, that too is instructive. And what it tells us is now it's a time to stop. Stop and reconsider. Stop and absorb. Stop and have some introspection. Stop and allow the emptiness, so to speak, to be helpful to you. And the first thing that we're shown in the Torah, the beginning of the exile in Egypt, is the lack of white space. Because their hearts were closed up. Their eyes were clammed up. And there's no break. That's how it starts. That's the first beginning of the exile. And here, chapter 6, verse 9, this is really the end. Because once we pass by this verse, it's the redemption. The first early stages of the redemption, of course, the seven plagues in our Parsha, 3 plagues in Exodus Parsha, Parsha's bow. Spoiler alert. And the Exodus. So this is the end, really, of the exile. And the last thing we hear about in the exile is they cannot hear Moshe. Why? Because they were working nonstop, and there was no way for it to penetrate. There's no white space. There's no availability for something to land upon their hearts. Thus, the bookends of the nation's enslavement in Egypt. The first indication, the last indication, that of course always reveals to us the essence of it. And it's all about the removing of the white space, of the capacity and the time to reflect, to ponder, to consider, to evaluate, to assess, and to contemplate. And again, this is not just important for us, as trying to study with the events of the events of 300 years ago, our nation in Egypt. Everything that we read about Pharaoh is true about the Yetzer Hara. And this is a primary tool of the Yetzer Hara, just as it was the primary tool of Pharaoh. And if you want to triumph over it, you want to win, you need to carve out some white space. You need to make sure that there's time for reflection. I want to read for you another short citation from Ramchal. This is not from Mesilas Yesharim, The Way of the Upright, but from instead a different work with the very exciting and compelling title of Derech Eitz Chaim, The Way of the Tree of Life. And in it he has a powerful statement on how important self-reflection, self-introspection, life analysis, how important these things all are. And he says, listen, when people think, most of the time they're thinking about their temporary life. The life of the body, the life that won't really matter in 100 years from now, certainly not 150 years from now. If people spend so much time thinking about their temporary life, why don't they spend an hour thinking about, contemplating the life that's actually consequential, their permanent life, the life of their soul? How come they don't take the time to think about who they are, what they're here to do? Why did the Almighty give them such a lofty soul? Why did the Almighty place them in this world? What does Almighty God want of us? What will be at the end? What's our plan for the afterlife? And then he says, again, this is Ramchal, a very, very reputable source. I'll read it to you in Hebrew, so I'm not fudging the translation here. Zosi ha-trufa ha-yoter gdola. This is the trufa. What's trufa? Trufa in Hebrew. Gotta practice our Hebrew. Trufa. All of us need to brush up on our Hebrew. Trufa means medicine. This is the most potent and great, I want to be accurate in translation here, medicine that can possibly be conceived, tuchalamtzi, neged hayetzer, opposite, in opposition to the Yetzer Hara. Vihikala, and it's easy. Upu'ulasa gedola. And its effectiveness, or what it effectuates, is great. Upiria rav, and its fruits are manifold. This is the best medicine against the Yetzer Hara that a person should stand. Again, this is a quote. Every day. Lefachot sha'ah. At least an hour. Panui. Available. Cleared from all other thoughts. To only think about this. To only be introspective. And you should inspect in your heart. What did the earlier ones, the forefathers, why were they so desirous by God? What did Moshe do? What did David do? What's a good thing to do? What's a good way to live? Ramchal tells us here that the most potent and powerful and effective tool against the Yetzer Hara, which again is the force that's trying to destroy us, the primary reason why we're here is to fight the Yetzer Hara. And the most potent tool to combat it is introspection. It's time where you're not thinking about anything else. There's no other competing thoughts that are dominating your perspective. And you're able to think about your life and what you're here to do. What's the goal? What Hashem wants of you? Why were you placed on this earth? What's your mission in life? How do you live up to your abilities? How do you make the most of your potential? An hour a day, at least an hour a day, he says. At least an hour a day. I want to tell you a cool story that I read in a memoir written by one of my grandfather's students. You know, the Musar masters, they had a theme that they like to repeat. That is that our life and the things that happen to us in our life, that's a form of Torah. What happens to you, it doesn't happen to you randomly. We know there's no coincidence, there's no happenstance. Everything is calculated. Everything comes from Hashem. It comes from the Almighty. Well, if it comes from the Almighty, then it's like Torah. It's like a prophecy. And you need to study it and find out what the message is. You have to learn from the events that transpire in your life. This hour that Ramchal is encouraging us to spend every day, a minimum of an hour. Now, don't feel bad. Don't feel guilty. We're all guilty of this. Are there 10 people in the world that do this? I don't know. Probably not. Or maybe yes, I don't know. He says it's easy. It's easy. And this is the most effective ammunition against the Yetzer Hara. An hour a day. Thinking about life. What you're living for. But it has to be an hour that you're clear of anything else. There's no other thoughts that are dominating your perspective. What's the result of this? What is a person who actually engages in self-analysis, clears out all the other thoughts and examines their life, thinks inwardly, not just externally? There's nothing else. There's no phone, no devices, no radio, no television, no people even. It's just you and you're thinking inwardly. So one of my grandfather's students, he wrote something unbelievable in his memoir. You know, most of us, our lives are just like an unidentified blob. With my grandfather, a blessed memory, everything was well thought out. Everything that happened to him was indexed, so to speak, in his mind as a form of Torah. And the story is told in this book about one of my grandfather's students my grandfather was a very famous rabbi and someone who many people sought his counsel. they had a problem in their lives and they wanted to speak to someone who was a wise person, who was an experienced person, who could give them some direction. So this student of my grandfather tells him there's another student who has a question, has a life dilemma. And I want you to speak with him. Now this student, the one who was given this task, he's trying to figure out, like, what's the angle over here? After all, you're the expert. Thousands of people come and ask you questions and seek your counsel and seek your advice. Read your books. Study from your lectures. You're the expert. I'm a 23-year-old student. It happens to identify the student's age. What's happening over here? So he comes over to my grandfather and says, what's going on over here? So my grandfather responded to him, listen to this. He responded to them, let me explain to you. People come to me with all sorts of problems. And every problem is unique. I'm not a prophet. How can I help someone who has a problem and I'm not a prophet? How can I help them? What's his methodology of assisting people who reach out and seek counsel for their dilemmas? So my grandfather tells the student, he says, in my head, I have a ladder. And on the ladder, there are hundreds of rungs. And every rung is associated with something that happened to me in my life. Something that happened to me, well, if it happened to me, I know the story. I know the factors and the variables at play. So when someone comes and asks me for advice, I don't just guess what the answer is. I don't just spitball and speculate. I reference my ladder. And I try to find which one of my life episodes corresponds to this person's problem. To find what's the solution, because I went through what they went through on some level, in some dimension. And if it happened to me, well, I know how it played out, and I know the variables, I know the factors. So I'm always scanning that internal ladder. Now this other student who came to ask me a question, I stand and I stand, and I don't find the answer. And therefore I thought, how can I give this person advice when I don't know the answer? So I thought maybe you would have the answer. So maybe you try to answer this other student's dilemma. Now, there is an epilogue to the story that the student who was giving the advice, after he gave the advice, my grandfather debriefed him, and he pointed out all the mistakes that he made in giving advice. He says, you did this mistake because of this reason, because you have this and this predisposition or bias. But to me, this story and this model of how you could become a student of your own life. You really should be writing your own autobiography, because every event that happens to you in your life, that's like a lesson from the Almighty. And you have to study it. And when do you study it? When do you study the most important Torah that's tailored for you? For most people, the answer is never. They're total strangers to their own life. They don't have necessarily a ladder with hundreds of rungs of every event that happened to them in their lives, and what the lessons were, what the variables and what the factors were, and what was the correct response, what was the wrong response, what were the biases that were at play beforehand. My grandfather, blessed memory, did spend an hour every day in that white space. with no other disruptions and no other factors that were intruding. And he became a student of his own life. And of course, once you become a student of real life, you're able to help other people as well. To me, this is a life-changing lesson. And again, I think it's easy to talk about, and it makes sense. It's very hard to implement, and it's especially hard today. Because people used to have, some white space in their lives. When you're waiting to check out at the grocery store, or you're waiting by a red light. I already told y'all on the podcast that whenever I'm by a red light and I'm a few cars behind, once the light, and I gotta make a left turn, so it's a short light. Once the light turns green, I already beep, because I assume that most of them are on their phones. I'll tell you, I did this like hundreds of times. Don't judge me. I did it hundreds of times, and no one ever complained. Because everyone knows, everyone's on their phones. You buy a red light, what do? There's a small little bit of white space that could save your life. But let's fill it with a little bit of the iPharo 16, iPharo 14. The Yetzer Hara's dominating. He's in full control. There's always something to do. There's a steady stream. You could scroll endlessly. Of course, I know it's emails, it's important text messages. And I have to say, I don't have an Instagram account, but I can't judge someone because I have no interest in it. Certainly not TikTok. I'm too old for this. I'm too old. Even though I'm technically a millennial, but I'm one of those older millennials. I still do have a weakness for Twitter. But I'll tell you, I'm proud to say this, but I don't think it's a cause for pride. When Yom Kippur came, I made a resolution to not look at Twitter even once until the first day of Hanukkah. And I'm happy to say that I was successful in that undertaking. And then, of course, the war breaks out and everyone's getting all their steady stream of news, and I don't really have that. But to me, this is an important step, or these kinds of initiatives are important to carve out some white space. What's Pharaoh doing? The beginning of the story is that the nation, their hearts and their minds and their eyes are closed up. And that's reflected in the Torah. There's no white space. And at the very end, Moshe's saying an encouraging message. He's saying good things. He's saying things that should provide a modicum of comfort. But Pharaoh and his devious plans, he removed any white space. There's just work. That's the beginning. That's the end of Egypt. That's the entirety of it. And just as Pharaoh did, the Yetzer Hara does. And if we want to win, if we want to overcome, if we want to take those lessons, that Torah of our own life, we got to find that white space. And once you have the white space, cherish it, utilize it, and use, again, what the Ramchal says is the most productive use of your time. To consider your soul, to consider your afterlife, to figure out what you're here to do. What does Hashem want of you? That's the most important question that any person can ever ask. I told my wife, I really want to do 1 week without my phone. Maybe after the fundraiser in February. Wouldn't that be a nice challenge? To do a whole week without your phone? We used to live in a very different world. In a world that there was white space baked into daily living. Today, it's a very different rhythm of life. And that's the primary damage, the spiritual damage of social media, of any sort of media that can fill up any space. I think it's also one of the most amazing benefits of Shabbos. Jews, since the Exodus, we've been keeping Shabbos. not doing all the categories of work that are prohibited on Shabbos. Today, it's so critical to modern living because if you don't have it, there's never any time. It's a crazy thing. There's never any time where someone's alone. You wake up and your phone's next to your bed, and you go to sleep and your phone's next to your bed, and at every time throughout the day, it's within hand's reach. Now, of course, it's important. You gotta listen to the podcast. I know that. But you have to remember, this is the beginning and this is the end of Pharaoh, of Egypt, of the Sahara. It's all about closing any windows of examination and contemplation and consideration. And if we're serious about extricating ourselves from Egypt, we must wage a campaign against the scourge of Egypt, the scourge of Pharaoh, the elimination of any moment of contemplation. Let's carve out that window. Let's find some white space. That will change our lives. I thank you for listening. This was enjoyable. I am so delighted that I came to the Torch Center to record this podcast. Have a wonderful rest of your day. A sensational rest of your week, and an elevating, edifying, uplifting, meaningful, and productive Shabbos upcoming, and please God, with the help of the Almighty, we'll talk again next week. And of course, the email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com.